This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the freshly redesigned Druid. If you want to hear more discussions of TTRPG design and philosophy, check out the Untitled TTRPG podcast I do with Rel over on his YouTube channel and on Spotify. And if you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. Druid is the first high-complexity class we'll be covering in this series. Like Cleric and Wizard, it's a full spellcaster, and its spell list is the third and final of the universal spell lists that were experimented with in the 1D&D playtest. However, Druid has a bit more going on with it than its spellcasting peers, particularly with its controversial Wild Shape feature that's seen significant redesign since the 2014 version. With Wild Shape, not only does a Druid player benefit from understanding the complexity of spellcasting, they have to understand how to read and implement creature stat blocks and know which stat blocks are most appropriate in a given situation. It makes Druids incredibly versatile, and although Druid options often don't have the outright punch that Clerics and Wizards have, it makes masterful Druid players difficult to pin down. Druid isn't about being the best at one thing, it's about being the right thing at the right time. So, what's changed between the 2014 and 2024 versions? Starting off, a little detail I missed with Cleric and Wizard is that spellcasters have a set number of prepared spells they can cast in 2024, as opposed to having it be related to their spellcasting ability. For example, in 2014, Clerics and Druids could prepare a number of spells equal to their Wisdom modifier plus their level, whereas in 2024, there's a column on their class features table that has a set progression regardless of their Wisdom modifier. It's a little change that I think is ultimately good. It just removes a little step in creating a character that's going to be complicated enough already. Next, at first level, Druids select a primal order, similar to the Cleric's Holy Order, where they can choose to have proficiency in martial weapons and medium armor, or gain an extra cantrip and add their Wisdom modifier to Arcana and Nature checks. Another little note is that Druids are no longer restricted to wearing non-metal armor, which was a flavor feature that led to some mechanical clunkiness in 2014. Speaking of mechanical clunkiness, Level 2 brings us the notorious Wild Shape, which has seen many experimental iterations over the 1D&D playtest. In 2014, the feature allowed a Druid to magically shapeshift into a beast with certain CR and trait limitations, such as reserving forms that could swim for levels 4 and up, and forms that could fly for levels 8 and up. However, when it came to the breadth of stat blocks within those restrictions, the only limitation on the number of different forms was that a Druid just had to have quote-unquote seen the beast it wanted to turn into. This vague limitation led to many exhausting negotiations between players and DMs about what beasts the character would have reasonably seen in the world prior to the campaign. For example, would it be plausible for them to have seen a giant boa constrictor? How common are axe beaks in the DM's world? Now, in 2024, this argument is avoided by having Druids prepare limited wild shape forms just like spells. At second level, when they get the feature, they have 4 forms to prepare, and are able to replace one of the prepared forms during each long rest. At 4th level, this increases to 6 forms, and at 8th level, it increases to 8. In addition, the rules explicitly state that Druids can pick any beast form within the CR and trait restrictions that are in the monster manual, as opposed to needing to have, again, quote-unquote, seen the form. So there's no need to argue over what's available. However, the DM can permit stat blocks from other sources, although this is expressly in the DM's purview, so they don't have to worry about a player surprising them with some game-breaking stat block from some obtuse published adventure. As mentioned earlier, in 2014, Druids couldn't wild shape into forms with a swim speed until level 4. That restriction has been removed. The only speed restriction in 2024 is that Druids still need to wait until level 8 to use forms that can fly. Other wild shape changes include that wild shaping is now a bonus action for everyone, as opposed to just being for moon druids as it was in 2014. The number of uses increases beyond just 2 at levels 6 and 17. The wild shape replenishment economy has gotten a little more involved than simply short rest, long rest. And Wild Companion has been officially imported from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything to being part of the core game. One major change, and one that's received mixed reception from the community, is that in 2014, when you wild shaped, you would adopt the hit points and hit dice of the beast you transformed into. And when those hit points went away, you would transform back into your regular form. Now when you wild shape, you gain temporary hit points equal to your druid level. And instead, you remain in wild shape until the time runs out, your character's incapacitated, or they die. So it's much harder to knock a druid out of wild shape through pure damage. The 2014 version led to some funky outcomes, like low-level druids wild shaping into brown bears and having way more hit points and damage output than optimized barbarians or fighters of the same level. By simply giving some temporary hit points and tying incoming damage directly to the druid's normal hit points, druids now have to be a lot more considerate before wild shaping and charging straight in toward a target. Another little note on the brown bear specifically, it still has multi-attack, but its damage output has been significantly reduced. One last addition to the druid base class is Elemental Fury at 7th level. It lets druids add their wisdom modifier to the damage of cantrips, or add 1d8 cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage to weapon or wild shape attacks. It's similar to the 2024 Cleric's Blessed Strikes, and it's a welcome damage bump that just wasn't in 2014, so it's appreciated. Circling back to the class's complexity, Druid is arguably the most complex class in the game, because it not only asks a player to manage the function of a full spellcaster with a highly nuanced spell list, but asks players to also understand how beast stat blocks work and how to manage them. In the hands of a skilled player, druids are incredibly engaging to play, but in the hands of a newer player, or a player that doesn't enjoy crunchy mechanics, it can easily become overwhelming. So, what is the druid's role in the party? I find that in combat, druids are excellent at support and control, sitting somewhere between clerics and wizards. Like clerics, they have access to standard healing spells, cure wounds, and healing word. Like wizards, they have some great battlefield control spells, like Entangle, which can restrain multiple targets in an area, and Fog Cloud, which obstructs line of sight. That being said, because these spells have a set area and a rather large one, druid players have the possibility of accidentally disrupting their teammates. So it demands a mindful playstyle where you're setting area of effects optimally so that way you don't take away from your allies' effectiveness. After all, a misplaced fog cloud can obstruct your allies' line of sight just as much, if not more, than for enemies. The one thing druids lack, until maybe later on, is heavy damage dealing options. Cantrips like Thorn Whip and Starry Wisp deal okay damage, but they aren't competing with Toll the Dead or Firebolt. At 5th level, while wizards have access to Fireball or Lightning Bolt, and clerics get Spirit Guardians, the obvious damage spell druids get is Call Lightning, which has a significantly longer duration, but each casting doesn't have the same punch as those other spells. That being said, druid can have some pretty ridiculous damage output, but it requires some in-depth mechanical knowledge and proper cooperation from allies to use most effectively. For example, Treant Monk, a YouTube optimizer, has shown just how broken the Spike Growth spell can be, and very recently released a video on the overwhelming power of the new version of Conjure Woodland Beings. To reiterate, to unlock the Druid's full potential, it requires a highly knowledgeable player piloting the character, as well as cooperative teammates that can take advantage of what the Druid is setting up. Out of combat, Druid also has incredibly strong utility options to help gather information. Animal friendship and speak with animals can do wonders in avoiding combat or gathering information. In fact, that's one of the most iconic uses of Wild Shape, turning into a rat or a spider to slip into a room for surveillance. Moving on to subclasses, in previous episodes, I organized each class's subclasses in order of simplest to most complex. I did the same here with Druid, but I may change my mind on this order later on. First up is the Circle of the Sea, a new subclass that leans into ocean-flavored spells. It's reminiscent of the Tempest Domain Cleric, sharing a good amount of its expanded spell list. At 3rd level, Circle of the Sea gets Wrath of the Sea, a bonus action use of Wild Shape that creates an emanation that deals damage and pushes creatures away. Some initial criticism I saw toward the feature was, Druids shouldn't be getting in melee. But sometimes you fight an enemy that can teleport or fly, and sometimes you need a nice emergency feature that has the possibility to just push that creature out of range, allowing you to move without needing to disengage and possibly take an opportunity attack. The later level features are also passive buffs, like giving your character a swim speed, unlocking a fly speed and resistance to cold, lightning, and thunder damage while Wrath of the Sea is active, and being able to give Wrath of the Sea to an ally. To review what I look for in terms of how complicated mechanics are, how much does a player have to remember? What choices does a player have to make before, and what choices does a player have to make during gameplay? In the case of Circle of the Sea, most of these features are memory-based. What extra spells do you need to remember? Remembering how Wrath of the Sea works, and then maybe it's knowing the best timing of when to use it. But overall, I would say of all the subclasses, I think Circle of the Sea is probably the simplest. Which brings us to the next one, Circle of the Stars, which originally debuted in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Unlike the 3 other subclasses, this one doesn't have an expanded spell list. Instead, it just grants Guidance and Guiding Bolt as long as you're holding your star map, and you can cast Guiding Bolt for free up to a number of times equal to your Wisdom modifier. Which is a great reminder that the whole bonus action casting limitations have been taken out of this version, and instead, you only get to use 1 spell slot per turn. Meaning that if you have a bonus action spell, like Healing Word, or if you get Misty Step, you can cast Guiding Bolt using this feature and still be able to use a bonus action spell that requires a spell slot. Again, Druid often lacks punch at low levels, so the free Guiding Bolts are nice. Now, the reason I think this is a little more complicated is, like Wrath of the Sea, Circle of the Stars gets Starry Form, but instead of having a set effect, every time you activate it, you choose between the Archer, Chalice, or Dragon. Archer grants a bonus action ranged attack, Chalice grants some extra healing, and Dragon increases the effectiveness of intelligence and wisdom checks and concentration saves. It's another example of just needing to know what the best option is in a given situation, but unlike Wild Shape, where you have to pare down from all of the beast stat blocks within a certain CR range, with Circle of the Stars, there are 3 options that you will learn pretty intimately over time. Now, the other thing is at 6th level, Circle of the Stars grants a random reaction option, which you roll for at the end of every long rest. You may get Wheel or Woe. Not only do you have to remember that this reaction exists, but you have to remember whether you're on Wheel or Woe to use it. While Circle of the Sea has a fairly set playstyle that builds over time, the more versatile options of Circle of the Stars and the random tracking of Wheel and Woe make Circle of the Stars a little more complex. Subclass number 3, the second to most complex, may surprise you. This one I'm giving to Circle of the Moon. Now, I am making a dangerous assumption here. I'm assuming that with each of these subclasses, a player is fully utilizing Wild Shape and has already learned the rules prior to their subclass selection. If a player hasn't been touching Wild Shape, but decides to go Circle of the Moon and then has to learn Wild Shape because of it, I think Moon would take the throne as most complex. However, assuming that a player knows how Wild Shape works, has some forms prepared, Moon doesn't add too much further complication. There's an expanded Circle of the Moon spell list to track, which is actually less than C. And there are just some boosts to Wild Shape. Moon Druids, as they could in 2014, can transform into beasts with a CR of Druid level divided by 3, whereas a level 3 Druid normally has a max CR of 1/4 at this level. Moon Druids now have a higher AC while in beast form, and the temporary hit points gained are 3 times as normal. The biggest complication here is you just have a lot more beast forms to choose from. Looking at the higher level features though, at 6th level, there are some boosts to your Wild Shape. At 10th level, your character gets a bonus action teleport, and at level 14, there's more boosts to your Wild Shape, and Moonlight's Step becomes even more powerful. In terms of what the subclass adds, Moon doesn't give you a lot more to remember, but the reason it ranks so high is that to make the most of it, you really need to understand how Wild Shape works. Whereas if you're using C or stars, you're likely using Wild Shape to activate those subclasses' alternative uses. Which, of course, brings us to what I think is the most complex Druid subclass, Land. Again, looking through the eyes of a newer player, Land gives you a lot of things to remember and a lot of difficult choices to make right at level 3. Unlike the other subclasses, Land Druids actually have 4 expanded spell lists that they can rotate between at the end of every long rest. Right from 3rd level, you get a bonus attack cantrip and a 1st and 2nd level spell. You have to remember that these spells are prepared, which gives you much more dynamic choices in and out of combat. Again, making the dangerous assumption that a player is also cognizant of Wild Shape, Land has an alternative Wild Shape use where you can set up a 10-foot radius sphere that can damage multiple creatures and heal up to 1 creature all at the same time. And if you also combine this with some of the utility aspects of Wild Shape, right out of the box as a single class character, Land probably has more tools than even the Wizard at low levels. And if you're looking at the damage output or whatever of all these options, I'm not sure they're the most powerful heals or the most powerful damage dealers. But again, you can customize your character to fit the situation that you're in. So last bullet point, moving on to multi-classing. I really have similar feelings to Druid as I did to Cleric. If Druid is your main class, I find that delaying your spellcasting progression by multi-classing into something else isn't worth it most of the time. Of course, exceptions would include things like knowing that you have a set level to work with. So if you have a DM that's like, hey, I'm thinking of running a level 6 one-shot, or knowing that you're playing a published adventure with a set level range, maybe there's a creative build that you want to try. But Druid is so versatile by itself that I can't think of any dips off the top of my head that would mechanically benefit it as the base class. That being said, on the other side, Druid is great for dipping into. Wild Shape is a great mobility and utility feature that could benefit other characters, granted that it doesn't interfere with Keystone class features. For example, I wouldn't take levels of Druid if it means your martial character loses out on extra attack. However, one of the key features of Wild Shape is that your character maintains their class features. One of the most popular multi-classes in 2014 was Barbarian, a bear totem warrior barbarian that used Wild Shape to improve their base stats while keeping things like rage and possibly extra attack. And just looking at the features, I think something like even a berserker barbarian would mesh well with Wild Shape mechanics. And one last little note, the nice thing about Primal Order and Holy Order is that it allows you to not overlap proficiencies. So let's say you are playing a ranger and you already have proficiency in martial weapons and medium armor. If you multi-class into something like a cleric or a druid, you can ignore the martial weapon proficiency option and go more with the extra cantrip or bonuses to intelligence checks. So that way, you're getting the most out of the choice you're making, as opposed to checking off the same box twice. Overall, Druid is one of, if not the most complicated class in the game, and I think it's good to have a complex option. Next up, we'll be contrasting this high complexity class with one that's much simpler, the Barbarian. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Fesliyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at fesliyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, and the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.